this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In April 1945, with the Allies closing in, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, with his German bodyguards, decided to flee Milan. The convoy was later joined by a Luftwaffe column retreating towards Germany, making it a powerful force. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Mussolini's last days, the race between the OSS, the SOE, and the Italian partisans to kill or capture him. I'm joined by Malcolm Tudor. Malcolm is an Anglo-Italian author specialising in Italy during World War II. He was last with us for episode 86 discussing the SAS in Italy. His new book is Mussolini, The Last 10 Days, A New Investigation. Malcolm, welcome back. It's nice to have you with us again. Now, before we get to the last days of Mussolini in April 1945, let's set the scene. He was overthrown and arrested in July 1943. What had he been doing in the intervening time through to sort of April 45?
Mussolini basically has been a feature of Italian life for a whole generation from 1922. People grew up with Mussolini, really. As a result of his military misadventures, he lost his popularity. At one time, he was very popular in the 1930s, especially once they invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia. By 1945, he was largely unpopular. In summer of 1943, he was overthrown by his own fascist council with the help of the king and imprisoned in various places, but kept out of the hands of the Allies, interestingly. In September, then, he was rescued from what he described as the highest prison in Europe, the Gran Sasso. He was rescued by German special forces and taken in a daze to Germany by aircraft and ordered overnight by Hitler to set up a fascist republic. Obviously, Italy had been a kingdom until then, in German-occupied Italy. His son, Vittorio, described Mussolini at the time as in a daze. From there, he was taken to Salo on Lake Garda and given the trappings of a head of state, but effectively, he was a prisoner of the Germans and almost under house arrest, but strangely held diplomatic meetings with the Japanese ambassador and similar things, whereas at the same time he was spied on constantly, had a German doctor imposed on him and not allowed to go anywhere without their permission. April 1945, then going forward, the two main Allied armies, the 5th and the 8th, were advancing at speed after a period when they'd been stuck really over the winter, very immobile over the winter. But as soon as spring came, the Allies advanced from the north, while at the same time synchronizing with the partisans a national uprising. Fearing the consequences, poor old Mussolini stuck on Lake Garda. He knew that there was one last throw that he could attempt, which was to leave the backwater of Lake Garda and move to Milan. Stayed in Milan a week, left on the 25th, and ventured then along the western shore of Lake Como, either to break out with the Germans and reach safe territory with them, or possibly to escape to the nearby border with Switzerland.
Is he essentially what is a lame duck Italian government with half the bureaucracy sort of trailing after him at this point? Or is he just sort of a forlorn figure travelling around with a German bodyguard?
He was still effectively, even 10 days before his death, he was effectively the head of state. He was still backed up by the Germans. And I'd like to bring out as well that Adolf Hitler had a great friendship for Mussolini, which is sometimes neglected to discuss, and he was always out to save him from all his misadventures. So he had a strong German escort, an SS man, and an escort of SS men and also secret service men. He had all the trappings of his puppet government, so he had all the ministers, all the main ministers, those who hadn't disappeared into the background somewhere. They were loaded with cash. They had thousands and thousands of pounds. They had gold. They had foreign currency, including sovereigns, British sovereigns, American dollars, Canadian dollars. They had all their wives and family that they could take. They had everything, really, that a person would take probably in such a dire situation. So it was a massive convoy, actually, yes, that went to Milan.
Travelling circus.
Yeah, it was, yeah. And, of course, with the knowledge that the Allies were hammering at the door, actually suspicions of their German allies, because they weren't too keen on them all along. So, yeah, it was quite a cavalcade anyway.
How much was Mussolini in charge of his own, I was going to say movements, I was going to say destiny, movements? Are the Germans shadowing him and moving him around? Because it's essentially, he's under German guard, isn't he? They're not Italians guarding him so much as he has a squad of SS with him.
We'll see on the journey that he tried to break out at 4 o'clock in the morning from the Germans, and it led to confrontation. The German commander of the SS that was accompanying him ordered his men to attention and advanced towards Mussolini with a machine gun and said, "Duce, you can't leave without my permission," whereas Mussolini said, "I go wherever I like and I do what I like." But then Mussolini backed down and meekly left in the morning instead. So it was brittle relationship at the end, because Mussolini, at one time he'd admired Hitler around about 1938, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. He admired Hitler, but by this time he got fed up with the Germans, and he was really feeling, well, actually he was fed up with the Italian people as well, but that's another story.
When he's moving around, are the partisans actively looking for him? Is there a plan in place to pick him up? I mean, this might lead to another question I was going to ask about the partisans as well, actually. How organised are the partisans? We talk about partisans. Are these almost like small brigand groups with no central control? And so there's nobody really looking for him, but they're all looking for him.
Partisans, by this stage, were pretty powerful, not least because of all their dealings with the Allies. The Allies had reservations at first, partly because the partisans were dominated by the communists. So in 1943, for example, they were a bit wary, but they still held important meetings secretly in Switzerland with the partisans and the resistance. But by 1945, they'd had a big secret meeting between the Allied leaders and the partisan leaders, the resistance leaders in the liberated South in December. So by 1945, and the Allied advance and partisan rising, it was all synchronized. There was certainly a strong central command, and actually Milan, where actually fascism had first taken off and where Mussolini took refuge for that week from the 18th to 25th, was the underground capital of the resistance. Very powerful. By this time, the Allies had got strong links, not only by communications, by radio, but also in the person of several secret agents embedded with the partisan command in Milan. I can say that from December 1944 to April 1945, that they were in lockstep, the partisans and the Allied command. If you think of the smaller units, then taking away from the larger network of partisans, the actual partisans that eventually captured Mussolini were described at the best as a ragtag assortment. The people who set it off, there were only 8 in number, and it was just Mussolini's ill fortune that he met a particular group of well-led and relatively well-armed partisans under a superb leader who was just a young Florentine nobleman on Lake Como.
Do you want to tell us about the partisan leader who you're referring to? He's the Count, isn't he? Is that his code name or his nickname?
Florentine nobleman with the splendid name of Pier Luigi Bellini delle Stelle. His code name was Pedro for some reason. More Spanish, I'd have thought, than Italian, but his sister was a teacher on Lake Como, and in the summer of 44, he trekked with a few companions all the way from Florence up to Como, and first of all became a detachment leader, and then he became leader of the 52nd Garibaldi Partisan Brigade. Brigades in Italian terms at the time were very liquid. A brigade wasn't a brigade in any terms understandable to any Allied commander, but to just a small number of detachments put together. But anyway, all through 1944, early 1945, they carried out various sharp attacks, taking out the odd fascist leader. You know, they had a terrible time, terrible weather, lack of supplies. They never established contact with Allied airdrops. They lost men as well, partly through desertion because of the terrible conditions. Lake Como, you know, we've all got a bit of a romantic view, obviously nowadays, for Lake Como, but over the winter, 44, 45, it was really harsh and terrible. And fascists really were in control of the villages, and the partisans then were at the top of Lake Como on Monte Berlinguera, which is the high peak that dominates the top of Lake Como. They were strong in the morale, I would say, that they had, but weak in logistical terms until the spring.
So had they been actively stopping armed convoys, German and Italian convoys, or hampering them?
This is the interesting thing. In 1944-45, they were reduced to carrying out classic guerrilla warfare, which is just blowing up the odd substation, which they're doing in Ukraine with the Russians at the moment, I think. And things like that, little, not comparable at all, but little niggardly little actions. But last few weeks of the war, everybody knew that the partisan rising was underway. The Germans knew this, and basically the Germans wanted to get home as soon as possible and get out of this terrible war and get away from the Allies as well, because of the 5th and the 8th Armies and powerful firepower. So the Germans in retreat, fascists in flight, whereas over the winter it had been static, as I mentioned earlier. Situation now in these last few weeks was completely fluid. So most of the German retreating columns were let through, either because the partisans were too weak to stop them, or because they were quite aware that they only wanted to leave home and weren't hostile anymore. In fact, Mussolini's convoy was then joined by a massive 200-strong Luftwaffe air column that was also in retreat, so they joined up together anyway. That column reported that they'd been stopped at various partisan checkpoints, but let through because the Italians basically knew that they were no threat any longer. And, you know, the Italians were a very friendly bunch, so you can imagine after the terrible conditions that the people had experienced, they were jolly happy to see the back of the Germans. So I can imagine at quite a lot of checkpoints they were let go of it with gay abandon.
I was going to say that you mentioned this is quite a powerful convoy with Mussolini, his guards. There's the anti-aircraft unit, yet the partisan unit that pull them up have, let's say, 8 men. So why did they think with 8 men? What's their leverage with this column with Mussolini in to stop them?
It all set off on the morning 26th when the little group of partisans, 8 in number, come down from the mountains to one of the villages on the lakeside of Lake Como where the Germans had just abandoned. It was the first time they'd been able to come in freely. to a village called Damaso. Then they summoned down the rest of their guys. There were only 20 in number then, so effectively there were 20 in number that the Count could rely on. Over the next few hours, they carried out various actions against the odd German barracks. There again, the German commanders, 3 or 4 different places, right up to the top of the lake actually, were persuaded to surrender and given safe conduct because it was in everybody's interest. Nobody wanted to fight. They'd had enough of fighting. When this massive, as I said, 200-strong convoy with so many vehicles and Italians straggling along turned up, it proved to be a different matter. Firstly, because geography dictates a lot of military history, and the place that the partisans had decided to put their roadblock is described as one of the prettiest places in Italy, but it was a very sharp curve on the side of Lake Como, western shore, as I said, just before the village of Dongo, at a place called Musso, which was a hamlet, really, just before Dongo. And they placed their roadblock right on a sharp curve. On one side, the rock rises on, well, actually on the left-hand side, sheer rock. So the road is carved out to the rock side. On the other side, sheer drop into the lake. And it was only really possible for one vehicle to pass at a time. So really, the partisans chose a brilliant place to stop any convoy that was passing. In fact, now the access has been taken by a tunnel through the rock at the side of the road. So, it was a brilliant place to stop any convoy. And of course, as we've seen in Ukraine, once a convoy stopped at one end, the whole convoy stopped. By this time, the German fascist convoy had an armoured car in the lead. So the partisans thought, right, we'll stop the armoured car. It was about 7 in the morning. They opened up with a couple of machine gun fire. Unfortunately, it killed a marble worker who was off to work in the fields, but it didn't kill any Germans. But anyway, the armoured car with Mussolini on board, actually, ground to a halt, and the officers in there got out and said they'd like to speak to the partisans. The Count, anyway, ordered that they would stop, and the German commander in charge, he was a Luftwaffe lieutenant, he was very indignant that they had been stopped because, as he pointed out to the Count, look here, mate, I've passed numerous partisans along the way and no one has stopped us, so what are you playing at? Well, the Count said either they lacked orders or weren't strong enough. But as you can see, we're here in force and could wipe you all out in quarter of an hour. So that led to a long process of negotiation between the Germans and the Count and his other officers, which took until past midday. It led then to an agreement that the convoy would go on to Dongo, which is the larger town. It would be put in the square and inspected, and under the agreement, only Germans would have permission to leave, while any Italians would have to be surrendered. So it's a bit of a devil's agreement in a way, but that was what was agreed.
Did the partisans have any inkling that Mussolini could be in the convoy? And presumably, I'm just going to follow that, it's a bit of an odd agreement because if they're going to search the convoy, they'll find Mussolini in it.
That's where they thought of a brilliant ruse, which is the only ruse open to them. Mussolini, rather reluctantly, was ordered to join the Luftwaffe men in disguise, as the head of his SS bodyguard was called Fritz Berser, second lieutenant he was, of the SS. He told his colleague, who was the actual leader of the whole convoy, the German lieutenant, he told him that he had to do it because there's no alternative. He had orders to safeguard Mussolini and nothing else could be done. Mussolini's lover, Claretta Petacci, she accompanied the convoy as well. She persuaded a reluctant Mussolini to agree to the German officer's advice. He put on a German greatcoat and a helmet. Quite often people say he was in disguise as a soldier, but in fact he was in disguise as an airman in airman's uniform. Then he was put on the back of the fourth lorry in the convoy. He was told to keep out of the way as much as possible. When the partisans then came to check all the lorries, about 30 odd vehicles from the Germans alone, all heavily equipped with mortars, machine guns and all the rest, equipment. It took quite a while for the inspection to take part. Anyway, when they came to the fourth lorry, they had an idea. There was a rumour that Mussolini was trying to escape. Earlier in the day, in fact, one of the fascists from the convoy had told the local priest at Musso that he thought Mussolini was probably in the convoy. So they were careful anyway, but it was only a matter of routine, the check. They didn't expect to find Mussolini. One of the partisans, Urbano Lazzaro, who we haven't mentioned yet, he was one of the Count's lieutenants. He was told by the local cobbler, who'd just taken on the guise of a partisan, that he'd found a person that he thought looked like Mussolini. But Lazzaro said, "You must be dreaming, man, you're crazy." Anyway, he took him to the lorry. The Germans surrounding the lorry said, "Ubriaco, ubriaco, he's drunk," because Mussolini was with his back against the side of the lorry, towards the back of the lorry. He said, "He's drunk," and made gestures of a person drinking from a glass, trying to dissuade Lazzaro from looking any further. But Lazzaro leapt onto the lorry then, and the man looked crumpled, and his face was covered by the helmet, and his greatcoat was pulled up almost right over his face. So Lazzaro took off his helmet, and the man was wearing sunglasses. Once he took off his helmet, he recognized the pate, bald head of Mussolini, and he said, "In the name of the Italian people, I arrest you." Mussolini, he was resigned to his fate by then, I think. He was resigned to his fate over the last few weeks and months, actually. But anyway, he said, "I offer no resistance." Mussolini was helped down from the back of the tailboard of the lorry and taken to the town hall through a mob, actually. Townspeople had gathered at this time and taken to safety then by the partisans into the town hall of Dongo.
It's amazing that the Germans just sort of give him up at the end. It's just like, well, you can have him. We've had enough. We're off.
Well, again, his SS bodyguard chief, Lieutenant Bertzer, questioned after the war why they hadn't offered resistance. Again, was quite defensive on the point. He said, "I was simply a second lieutenant, simple soldier. I had orders to protect him, but after the agreement that the leader of the convoy had made with the partisans, there was to be no more fighting. What would be the wisdom of me indulging in warfare at the end of a war where everybody had agreed on the outcome?" Again, Mussolini, once he was held by the partisans, he was taken to barracks in the evening in the mountains. And again there, he was very, very indignant that the Germans had, in fact, he said they'd betrayed me, and they've always treated us as slaves, and all they did was throw blankets over me till I nearly suffocated when he was captured.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Malcolm Tudor, and we're discussing the last days of Mussolini. So is there a protocol for the partisans? Had the word gone out what to do if you managed to pick up Mussolini? Is there a chain of command to report back up to see what to do with him?
Oh yes, they all had their orders. The partisan central command had issued an edict, really, a decree that partisan forces should immediately arrest all the senior fascist leaders. According to the decree, because of their crimes over a whole generation since 1922, as the partisans saw it, all their crimes, they would either be subject to capital punishment or, in lesser cases, to life imprisonment. It was quite clear that he was the head of your enemy forces, so obviously his capture was the number one priority for everybody. It was for the Allies as well. We haven't mentioned that, but the Allies in September 43, once the Italian armistice and surrender with the Allies was signed, had orders to arrest the chief fascist associates and all persons suspected of having committed war crimes will forthwith be apprehended and surrendered into the hands of the Allied forces. And the American OSS, which was their intelligence agency, all their agents in northern Italy had orders to capture, protect, and bring back alive all important fascist officials and German commanders, especially Mussolini, Graziani, who was the military commander of the fascists, and the members of Mussolini's puppet cabinet. So everybody basically knew that Mussolini was the chief target, and they certainly knew what to do with him.
And the OSS almost got him once in Milan.
There were several near misses from the Allied point of view of Mussolini over the years. In 1943, Churchill put a stop to an order in 1943 to take out Mussolini by bombing his villa in Rome because it was too near the Vatican, basically. Coming to the present story, the SOE, the British Subversion and Sabotage Agency, had a leading agent, or their leading agent in northern Italy, embedded with the resistance. And on the 25th of April, at the end then of the first week of Mussolini's stay in Milan, a meeting was held, a final throw of the dice. Mussolini met his mortal enemies, the leaders of the resistance, under the mediation of the Archbishop of Milan. Now, at this meeting, Max Salvadori, who was Lieutenant Colonel of SOE, embedded with the resistance, he planned with moderates on the Liberation Committee, the Underground Liberation Committee, to seize Mussolini once he'd gone to the meeting and agreed to some sort of surrender. But instead, at the meeting, Mussolini got irate and indignant with the terms he was offered and stormed out of the meeting and fled then to Lake Como. That was all set up, an SOE plan to arrest Mussolini and take him into captivity on the 25th. So that was one attempt. Then equally, the Americans of the OSS, which is Office of Strategic Services, their leading intelligence agency, they'd send an important lieutenant from Switzerland to arrest Mussolini. He arrived at the partisan underground headquarters on the 27th of April in the evening. The following morning, the partisans sent their actual death squad from Milan. Ferruccio Parri, who was the first Prime Minister of Italy after the war, himself an ex-partisan, said that the American lieutenant, if he'd have been a few hours earlier, he'd have found out about the death squad being sent from Milan, and the fate of Italy would have been completely different. So there are two real chances that the Allies had to arrest Mussolini themselves, but didn't happen, as we see.
So you have alluded now to this death squad being sent out. Was it a death squad that was, well, it clearly is, but was it intended to be a death squad when it was when the partisans, when the Count requests or help from the chain of command, and I've forgotten the name of who they sent out, and I don't see it in my notes. But when they send him out, were those in theory meant to take Mussolini and take him back to Milan alive for trial?
Politics in Italy is so important that the liberation movement was composed of different strands from different parties. You wouldn't think of the British resistance that was being employed in fear of German invasion. You wouldn't think that it was organised amongst conservatives, Labour, Liberals or whatever. But in Italy, the resistance was organised along party lines, mostly dominated by the communists, but with other parties as well, strong parties. And the liberation, the central command in Milan, again, was split between the different representatives. The ones on the right, the Christian Democrats, for example, the Liberals, were very keyed in with the Allied instructions to secure Mussolini and hand him over to them. Whereas the communists and a few others were hostile to that view. But again, as I bring out in the book, so many of the partisan leaders had endured imprisonment, torture, death of family members, death of their friends, bombings and all the rest. So they didn't have this view of what should be done with Mussolini. So the Liberation Central Command was divided. In fact, they set up what was called an insurrectional committee of only 4 people that would direct the exact and precise partisan rising, including obviously what should be done about Mussolini. But it was a split. Some wanted Mussolini to face justice and be handed over to the Allies. The more divergent view was that he should be killed immediately under their decree that they'd announced just a few days earlier.
It's Colonel Valerio sent from Milan, isn't it, to pick him up from the partisans. Did the partisans who held him expect Valerio to take him back to Milan? Did they have any expectation of what was about to happen next?
It was all a murky enterprise altogether. Odizio, he's an interesting character. He was the accountant before the war, the accountant at a hat factory. He did have military experience as an officer cadet, but his subsequent military career then was as a partisan. But he definitely had some expertise in people control, because once he set out with escort to take out basically Mussolini, he pretended to the partisans forces that were just taking over in Como and all the other major cities. He pretended to them initially that he was definitely acting under orders of the Liberation Committee to take him back to Milan. And this is the false guise that he put on when he appeared in Dongo and met the Count and all his officers. I
wonder if that was just a convenient way to bypass any form of conversation about what was to happen next. Because he certainly doesn't get anywhere near Milan alive. How far does he take him before it's basically summary execution, isn't it?
That's right. Well, on the 28th, as we say, Audizio's men set off in the morning. They arrive after a number of contacts with partisan roadblocks and arrive in Dongo about 2:00 in the afternoon. There they argue with Count for a while. In the end, Audizio persuades the Count that he has to shoot Mussolini. The Count was, again, there's a lot of indignation in this story. Again, the Count was very indignant because the Count, I should have said, was a lawyer. He'd qualified as a lawyer in Florence. He felt that the fascists were known for their terrible treatment of prisoners and all the rest, and he didn't want that to happen in this case. He felt that Mussolini should face justice, but from a properly regulated court. In that case, that would have been in agreement with Allied stipulation, but in the end, the Count reluctantly agreed that all the fascist prisoners, the senior members that accompanied Mussolini, and Mussolini would have to be brought to Dongo to face justice there. And all the partisans were angry about it, but felt they didn't have any alternative, partly because by then the chain of command that at one time had been very loose from Milan was by now very strict, and they recognised that the colonel was a colonel, and so definitely a military superior. And also, Audizio, before leaving Milan, he'd got, again by guile and subterfuge, he'd got a pass signed by the American OSS agent, Lieutenant Daddario. He got him to sign a pass with an Allied stamp on it. Daddario was signing loads and loads of passes, so he didn't quibble about this one. And again, Audizio used a false name for the pass. So with documentation, two aspects of documentation and the chain of command, the local partisans then had to give in and agree that all prisoners would face capital punishment in one way or the other. Then Audizio and his other leading light called Lampredi and a local man called Moretti, a local partisan, drove up to the farmhouse that by this time Claretta, Petacci and Mussolini had spent their last night. And about 4 o'clock in the afternoon then marched Mussolini down the path, pretending that they'd come to liberate him, put him and Petacci against the wall of the villa, pronounced some sort of sentence of death in the name of the Italian people and carrying out justice, and machined them to death. Later in the afternoon then, the remaining senior fascist prisoners were also summarily executed on the square of Dongo overlooking the lake. A bloodbath altogether, in other words.
Yeah, then take his body. Where did they take his body to Milan then after that?
Yes, on the 29th, well, overnight on the 28th and 29th, Audizio took the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and the other, actually 15 leading fascists who'd been executed off to Milan overnight and dumped them all in the square, Piazzale Loreto. A bit of enhancement to say the square. It's more like the junction of several roads. It's a very nondescript place, but 15 partisans had been executed there the previous year, so it was a very symbolic place. The 29th then, bodies were just left on the floor, on the concrete. As soon as that happened, people began to arrive in their masses once they heard of the situation. And later in the morning, seeing the terrible state of the bodies, they were being spat on, shot at even, and kicked. Firemen arrived and lifted 5 of the bodies, including Mussolini and Claretta Petacci, by the ankles and hung them in the air for several hours. By this time, in the early afternoon, this spearhead of the American forces had just started to arrive, including the future Allied military government. The governor himself, Paletti, was arriving that day under American pressure. Paletti describing it as something like out of the Wild West. The bodies were taken down.
What I find slightly intriguing, so his executioner was sort of working on a pseudonym at the time. Was there any move to find the killers and try them potentially for murder? You know, what is the legal jurisdiction of shooting someone in cold blood like that? And especially as the Allies were after him and wanted him to put him on trial. He used the word murky before, which is a word I had in my notes. You know, a lot of this gets quite murky. What happens to his killers?
At the time, the Communist Party, as I said, they were the leading force in the resistance. They publicised straight away. It was made public. The local newspapers, Milan and all around, said that obviously headline news, and became world headline news, that Mussolini had been liquidated. But the Communist Party, by putting forward the name of Colonel Valerio, who only a few people knew who Colonel Valerio really was. Everybody had a nickname or an alias because they had to when you're a partisan or an agent. So nobody knew really who the real identity was of Colonel Valerio. For 2 years, that lasted from 1945 to 1947. 1947, because some of the political party representatives or the press were about to out Audizio as the mysterious Colonel Valerio, he himself admitted, if you like, to the fact that he had shot Lean. But again, that was rather a concoction, because actually Lampredi, who accompanied him, the other senior part of his little squad, was actually his superior. And as I write in the book, Audizio's cousin indicated that the day after the killings, Lampredi and Audizio had met up in her office, and she had been told to type a statement to the effect that Audizio was actually the killer, while at the same time he took notes from Lampredi what to say, and Lampredi said to him, well, there again, from now on, you're the hero, right? So really, again, the actual the actual murderer was rather in question there. But the Allies, once Charles Paletti, the American Allied military governor, arrived, the moderates on the Liberation Committee were very concerned that he'd be cross with them, but he said he'd found everything in perfect order in Milan. In fact, the partisans had secured all the strong points and utilities, etc., and said he was pleased with the situation he found. So they weren't accused at all of doing something that perhaps they shouldn't. And as for the magisterial side of it, several cases after the war looked at that. Some of the relatives of the fascists who'd been shot summarily in Dongo took out actions against Audizio and other fascists. But in all cases, the Italian court said it was during a period of German occupation, and in fact was an act of war. So everything was absolved. But honestly, I think people were so relieved that the war was over. The Italian people were so relieved that Mussolini's regime was over. Well, it had no choice. They had to move on. So there was no... And in the early 1970s, in fact, the Italian state issued an amnesty for any fascist actions altogether. So everything was legally absolved at that time.
Now, curiously, after the war, there's rumours surfaced that Mussolini was killed on the orders of a British, was it an SOE agent? Where does that come from? Is there any, what's the background to that?
Yeah, well, we all know Italy's the home of conspiracy theories. Now we all have conspiracy theories. So I think Italy's always had this thing about authority. So if authority says something, it can't be true. There's also the fact that the conditions or the statements at the time were so ambiguous that altogether rival theories started emerging almost straight away. Now, I've had this directly from one of my former SOE friends who was an agent. Actually, he was Max Salvadori's radio operator. So he was the radio operator to the leading SOE agent in northern Italy. When I asked him about these theories, about Allied involvement in the death of Mussolini, he said, oh yes, one of my colleagues showed me Mussolini's hat. So Mussolini's hat, yes, oh yes, he took him out, yes. But in fact, when I followed up on that particular agent was active at the end of the war in France. So that can't have been right. But certainly, numerous people have questioned what became called the official account put forward by the communists. It was questioned straight away. Certainly Allied. It's called the British thread or the American thread of the whole episode is a big topic and has been constantly in Italy. But I was interested to find out it was also slightly in SOE terms as well. In the 1990s, suddenly the story took on legs because an Italian engineer, quite a highly qualified engineer, came forward and said that, oh yes, it was all true. He had actually killed Mussolini on the orders of a British secret agent. In fact, he wrote a book. So really the story took off there. It was followed up by the press in Italy and in the United Kingdom. Bruno Giovanni Lonati, with the alias of Giacomo, was the gentleman who said he'd taken out Mussolini. It is a very compelling account, actually. A lot of detail. Because it's the leading conspiracy theory, I do devote one chapter, quite a long chapter of my book, to his account, because, as I say, he was a good writer. It does sound compelling, but also the fact arose that it was taken up then by a leading former OSS American agent called Peter Tompkins, who was their main agent in Rome during the war. Although he was never in northern Italy, he validated a lot of Lonati's account. I follow up on all the details of the story, but in the end, I say, did Lonati execute Mussolini on the orders of a British secret agent? I put in one word, no. But I felt it was necessary to deal with the major component of popular conspiracy theories. However, I have found out quite a lot more about the Allied involvement. Perhaps we can talk about that.
Well, I was going to ask you about the SOE involvement. Is that where it sort of started and finished in a conspiracy theory, or is there more to it unwittingly?
Yes, well, as I said, the Italian resistance was effectively under Allied control in operational terms, in terms of material, finances, and to a degree, military directions from December 1944. In February 1945, Max Salvadori, another nobleman, Anglo-Italian actually nobleman, was sent to Milan to liaise with the Liberation Committee. He was called upon at all important junctures of the final weeks of the war to liaise and discuss the situation with resistance leaders. Now, faced with the fact that the Italians had decreed that Mussolini and other leading fascists would either be shot, executed, and only in lesser cases subject to life imprisonment, he was called upon to make a statement in his closing days, hectic closing days of the situation. He made a statement, the final secret meeting, that in effect the Liberation Committee, the resistance movement, were basically the power in the land until the Allies arrived. And of course, that power included judicial decisions. It's been questioned since whether he was rubber stamping their intention or their ability to take out Mussolini immediately, or whether he was just stating the obvious. I asked my friend, the SOE agent, who was his radio operative on the start of the mission, I asked him, would Salvadori have masterminded an attempt to kill Mussolini? And Bill Pickering, who was a gentleman concerned, said, no, I don't think he would, because he wasn't that sort of fellow. But he said that equally, with orders, it's rather difficult to go back in time and decide. But certainly, as I said earlier on, they intended to arrest Mussolini on the 25th. So in a way, Salvadori was just stating the obvious, that the partisans had the effective power until the Allies arrived. However, my diligent searching has revealed completely final twist to the tale, because the insurrectional committee that I mentioned earlier, which was composed of 4 people that the partisans had set up just to actually oversee the final acts in the war. It's composed of 4 people. One was the communist leader in the north called Luigi Longo. The other communist on that committee was called Emilio Sereni, and the third member was Alessandro Pertini, who was a socialist, and the fourth member was called Leo Valiani, original name Leo Vaiksen. I already knew that he had been brought by SOE, as had Max Salvadori and a few others, his friends, from Mexico in the summer of 1943. I thought, well, that's interesting. Why was SOE bringing intellectual leaders like that all the way from Mexico, initially to Britain and then to Italy? Searching at the Public Record Office at Kew, I found Leo Valiani's personnel file, and surprise, surprise, he was fully fledged Italian agent of the British Special Operations Executive from the summer of 1943 to the 26th of July 1945. So we can say that 4 people immediately ordered the execution of Benito Mussolini, and one of them was secretly a British agent, Leo Valiani.
Well, with that bombshell that one of the 4 Italians who ordered the immediate execution of Mussolini was a secret SOE agent, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Malcolm. Loyal listener, if you want a full account of Mussolini's final days and Malcolm's new discoveries, the book is Mussolini, The Last 10 Days, A New Investigation. I will, as ever, put a link on the website and in the show notes. Now, don't forget, if you have enjoyed this podcast, you can sign up as a patron of the show at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And it is a big thank you to those who have already done so. $1 or so from each of you really does help me find the time to put the podcast together. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. It's been frantic here at Podcast HQ these last few weeks, and I'm not quite sure where we're going next, but I think we're returning to the topic of glider pilots, which I looked at way back in episode 13. But this time, we'll be looking at them from the American perspective. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.